Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this Saturday afternoon in York and for curtailing your lunch to come and hear us talk about food. Hopefully we won't make you any more hungry or we'll inspire you to go for another lovely meal later in the day, maybe. My name is Christopher Kissane. I'm a food historian. Actually, when I arrived in York yesterday in preparation for this event, I was walking through the square in the centre of the town, and I saw an absolutely massive queue snaking all the way out and around through the square. And I thought, first of all, obviously my first thought was, oh, the York Festival of Ideas is on. It's obviously but I was curious, as you might be, and walked up to one of the people in the queue, and I said, excuse me, you don't mind me asking, what are all these people queuing for? And this elderly Yorkshireman turned to me, and he, almost with a sort of a look of disdain, as if I didn't know why, said, I'm not going to do the accent because I'll just get it wrong. He said, it's the queue for the National Fish and Chip Museum, of course. And I said, well, I didn't even know there was a National Fish and Chip Museum. And because I was so enthused by this sort of eruption of interest in the history of food, I proceeded to start telling this man, unprompted, that I'm a food historian, and wasn't this wonderful that people were so interested in the history of what is now Britain's, one of Britain's national dishes, and so on, until he interrupted me and said, sorry, mate, they're doing 4p portions until 5 o'clock. So I'm afraid we don't have any 4p portions of fish and chips, but we do have quite an offering of different speakers to talk to you about the history of food. We have a mix of historians and chefs, and our historians, I think, are excellent cooks, and our chefs are well-versed in their history. So hopefully we'll have an interesting mix of things to talk about. And I think it's also especially great to be talking about food history at an event that explores the relationships between Britain and France, because the academic study of food history is something that has come very much from those two particular countries. The beginnings of food history in anthropology, in England especially, at the beginnings of the 20th century, in the late 19th century, and also sort of medical history of food that was pioneered in England. And then, of course, the work of the Annales School in France and French anthropologists, structural anthropologists in the 1960s and 70s, also people who sort of pioneered the academic study of food. But that said, it took a very long time, and food historians are always telling people about this, it took a very long time for food history to be taken seriously as an academic subject. There's a great line in a review from 1996 of a French book about medieval food by the American historian Barbara Ketchum-Wheaton, where she says that for decades, food history rarely got above the level of Charles Laughton playing Henry VIII, waving a drumstick in hand. And very luckily for those of us who now work in food history, that is absolutely no longer the case. It's a very vibrant field with all sorts of people working in all sorts of different ways, and that's something very much to be welcomed, and hopefully will give you a little bit of a flavour. That's not going to be the last terrible food pun in give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the different ways that people are approaching this subject in the 21st century. So all four of our speakers are going to give a little presentation, like in this morning's panel, and then we're going to have a group discussion between the five of us, and then we will have plenty of time for you to ask questions from the audience. So please start thinking about what you might like to speak about. So without further ado, we'll start with our first speaker, who is Loïc Bienassis. My terrible French pronunciation has been terrified of getting his name wrong all day, who is a researcher at the Institute of the History and Culture of Food in Tours in France, and who has written very extensively on the history of food, and especially on the history of regional foods in France. There's a fantastic book with the chef Joël Robuchon a couple of years ago that I absolutely loved. And Loïc is going to talk to us about food and identity in France. So, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's okay again. So first of all, I'd like to say I'm terrible at cooking. So just to be clear on that. And no, I want to thank the Festival of Ideas for inviting me, and Alice Béja from the French Embassy, and Sarah Mitchell as well, who works very hard and very well for welcoming us here. So I have to deal with several topics here. About national food identity, regional food identity, food heritage in France, 19th and 20th century, in 7 minutes. So, yeah, I guess I can do it. First of all, I'd like to raise some question about the very words I'm using here. Because you may you may have believed that I would talk about French recipes, food, and some very interesting things, but I'm afraid I will talk first about concept, which is more boring, I agree, but I think it's necessary to discuss this kind of issue. Because when I use this kind of expression, like national food identity, regional food identity, and so on, I mean, nobody is shocked by seeing these expressions used. Food heritage is very common now to talk about food heritage or food identity. But actually, it's not that obvious. Identity is a subject that, as you may know, historians and social scientists in general are working on a lot. Many kind of identities shape any individual, of course, gender, social, professional. And of course, all these layers of identity are also relevant regarding food. I mean, you can question food in relation with gender, for instance, with social background, of course. And here I'm dealing with what I would call territorial identities, national and regional. But it's only one kind of identity in a whole framework. Secondly, I think we must not confuse the notion of identity and the one of, I'm not sure that's the right word to use, what I would call appartenance, en français, belonging, in English, I guess. Because identity is when you consider yourself belonging to a certain group and that you consider it is a part of what makes you who you are. It defines you, or at least it defines you partially. But you can belong to a group and not being aware of it, and not, of course, claiming to be a part of it. Sometimes even you can refuse it. I mean, I guess you can, for instance, you can be English and not feeling yourself European. I guess it's just an hypothesis. So I guess for food, it's the same. I mean, it's when you deal with identity, you also must have this notion of belonging, which is quite different. So very often I think we deal with food identity, but it's also be considered as food belongings in a way. I'm not sure I'm clear about it. The tricky part of it is when, as an historian, you have to work on this kind of topic. You have to rely on discourses. What I mean is, discourses, I mean cookbooks, for instance, which is a kind of discourse, are produced by very few people. When you are an anthropologist, for instance, you can still interview people to ask them how they feel about food, about their identity or belonging. But as an historian, when you work on even late or early 20th century, you have to rely on books, and most of the books, cookbooks or any other kind of text, are produced by very few people. So when you have to think about food identity, actually, you rely on very few sources. It's really hard to know how the whole community perceives such dishes, such or such product. So keep that in mind, because I will have to, in a very short time, to give some general idea, but I have all this reservation beforehand to make. I would have the same kind of remark about the notion of heritage, because I like to say that heritage doesn't exist in itself. I mean, heritage is when a community, a society, has to give this specific quality, the quality of heritage, to an object, to turn it into an heritage. I mean, there is nothing, even the most prestigious building, which is a heritage in itself. That's a community which makes it an heritage. So, what's an heritage? It's what we see as a legacy from the past, of course, what we see as a legacy from the past, some goods we claim as ours and deem necessary to preserve. That's what we can consider to be an heritage, which means that food became an heritage when you consider, when you start considering a dish, for instance, a recipe, a product, as a tradition specific to a community, a tradition that must be preserved. That's when some products, some foods, some dishes start to be a food heritage. So they are not inherited by themselves. That's a very important point, because now we consider that, of course, food is an heritage, is a cultural heritage, but it's a whole process. So let me be more specific after this kind of generality. First, considering the link between Frenchness and cuisine. Actually, many things which has been said this morning are also relevant about food and cuisine. So it can be said that the feeling of superiority of the French cuisine, of the French about their cuisine, dates back to the 18th century, I think. We find then some French texts, some French authors, asserting that French cuisine is the best, the most respected, the most influential, the best in Europe. And it's not only another proof of the French arrogance, of course, maybe in a way, but it's also true. I mean, what's funny? I mean, no, it's true. For instance, that was a parallel we could make with the talk of this morning. We have lots of caricatures showing some effeminate Frenchman not eating like John Bull, some beef and meat for men and meat for Englishmen. You have lots of caricatures of this kind. But the thing is, when an English aristocrat really want a maître d'hôtel, they try to hire a French maître d'hôtel. So you have two kind of, I mean, there you have some representations of the effeminate Frenchman, but also you have the practice, the effective practice, and the fact that even in England, even what we sometimes call the Second 100 War, you also have lots of French cook and lots of French maître d'hôtel hired by the English aristocrats. So the fact that the reputation of the French cuisine was built in the 18th century. I mean, of course, it went on in the 19th century with all the prestigious French chefs like Antonin Carême and later on Escoffier at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, who were everywhere in Europe. Carême worked in England, for instance. So the reputation of the French cuisine was also the reflection of the reality of the situation, if I can say so. So there was this feeling of superiority. So when the national feeling, because it's really hard to know when the French population started to feel themselves, to consider themselves as Frenchmen. There's a whole book about it by Jean Weber, and when peasants turned into Frenchmen. So that's a lot of debates about it. When did the French started to feel French, in a way? And of course, you can have this kind of discussion in many countries. But the thing is, you have this feeling of superiority of the French cuisine already there. And during the 19th and 20th century, it just became something obvious for most of the people in France that the French cuisine was, in fact, the best in the world. So it's really just for a few decades that this feeling has been challenged, I guess. As for regional cuisine, the process is quite different. Actually, before the very beginning of the 19th century, there was no such things as regional cookbook. The first regional cookbooks were locally published during the 19th century. I give you some example there. So then that's how that's whole production, not everywhere in France, of course. They are still quite rare, and many regions don't have their own cookbook, their own reference, I would say. Then at the beginning of the 20th century, there were some books about regional cookings published in Paris, which was a new thing. And in the 1901, I guess, we can consider the one by Maurice Chardin is the first one. So does it mean that regional cuisines did not exist before? again, it's a complex issue. What can be said is that the culinary image of regions, of French regions, has been elaborated from the 19th century onward via cookbooks and various kind of texts. French regions have been progressively associated with some dishes and preparations, gastronomic reputation, which have endured until today. So that's a slow process which really started in the 19th century. For example, you see, the cassoulet was presented by some writers as a Languedoc, I would say, a flag, as a Languedoc symbol, as early as the 1890s. We can say the same almost even a bit earlier for the bouillabaisse in Provence. So that's the moment, late 19th century, when some specific dishes started, became symbol of some local identities. Actually, I think in that case, cooking, cuisine is not only is only a part of a broader process, actually of two processes and two phenomena. First, the regionalist movement. The regionalist movement and the building of modern regional identities from the second part of the 19th century onward. So cuisine is just one aspect of this building of these regional identities. Then, secondly, a process which is intertwined with the first one, what I would call the folklorization of material cultures. At the end of the 19th century, many authors have the conviction that their world is coming to an end because of the rise of the industrial society, of course, and that it's necessary to save what can be saved, objects, artifacts, and traditions. So that's, we know the work of Hobsbawm about the building of tradition at that time in England and Scotland. So we have almost the same process in France at the same time. So we must consider that cooking, cuisine is just a part in a broader process. Which leads me to my last point. When food has started to be considered as an heritage, as I defined it in my introduction. Precisely, I think, at the end of the 19th century. The first step in that direction was when culinary knowledge have been considered as one of the popular know-how to be saved and part of local identity. So at that very moment, we still don't talk about food as an heritage. In French, you say patrimoine. The word patrimoine is not applied to food before the late 20th century. But actually, the very beginning of the process, I think, was in late 19th century. And when, at the end of the 20th century, the word patrimoine became so common for everything. I mean, now everything is heritage. Everything is patrimoine. I mean, which was unthinkable in the 19th century, of course. We could speak hours about it. So again, food is just one part of a very broader process. These heritageization, it's generalized heritageization. I know I will stutter when I have to pronounce this word, heritageization. And food is just one part of this general process. So my point is, first, I'm only here talking about France. I mean, I don't pretend that the patterns I've isolated here are valid elsewhere. Actually, I think they are, but not with the same chronology. I think you can see the same kind of processes everywhere, but of course with different timing. Secondly, my fundamental point here is what we take for evidences, like all the word I used in my presentation, that food is an heritage, for instance. In fact, these concepts are historical constructions and, of course, cultural representations. Thank you.
very much, Loïc. I think perfect segue actually into our next speaker with your comments about the obviousness of the superiority of the French cuisine, because we're going to move on to hear from Joshua Overington, who is chef patron of Le Cochon Aveugle here in York, so one of your locals, Michelin-star chef, which is described as a small stripped-back restaurant in the heart of York. And we might be quite interesting to hear about the relationship between French, or the superiority, the perceived superiority of French cuisine from an English chef who is very French trained. So, Joshua.
So I'd just like to thank the Festival of Ideas for having me. Exactly. So I just want to talk a little bit about technique and the use of technique in my restaurant and through my career as a chef. And I've been basically based in French cuisine my entire career, and how I use old techniques and modern techniques, and which is superior, old French techniques or modern techniques. And I'll just give you a bit of history about me and the way I came to be where I am right now. But I started my career at Waterside Inn, which is a 3 Michelin-star under Alan Roux, and I was there for a short period of time, about 7 months, about 17, 18 years old. And at that point, I just didn't have the technique, I didn't have the skill to work at that level. Alan Roux sat me down and basically explained that, you know, if you want to really cook French food, if you want to do this type of cuisine, then you need to work in France. You need to go and study in France, even better. So I made the decision to move to Paris and go and study at Le Cordon Bleu there, and I didn't speak a word of French at the time, and did the lessons and trained myself up. But, you know, what it gave me at that point was an outlook of French cuisine, which, as a young man in my early 20s, I didn't appreciate that much. A lot of cream, a lot of butter. And I looked at it as it being old-fashioned, as it being uncool, essentially, and I never really took much notice of it. And at the time in Paris, what we called as the gastronomie movement was taking off, where a lot of high-profile chefs were taking over little tiny bistros and cooking Michelin-starred food in these tiny spaces. And I got hugely influenced by it. I really, really wanted to do it, and that's what I always saw myself doing in the future. But looking at it now, I look back at it and I sort of ignored all that classical French training, all the roux and the bechamels and the hollandaise sauces, all things I looked at as old-fashioned. So on my return to England, I worked at a lot of modern cooking places, a lot of molecular gastronomy places using new techniques, a lot of chemicals. And whilst working there, I discovered that that's not cooking, in my opinion. I wanted to actually cook things over flame and touch and feel. I actually wanted to make bread from scratch. I wanted to make butter from scratch. And I realized that whilst my time in France at the time might have not been that influential at the time, I started then to travel back and have a look what actually these gastronomy restaurants were doing. And actually what they were doing were cooking French food in a sort of modern fashion. But they weren't ignoring the classics, they were embracing them. They were still doing dishes like hare à la royale, but just serving it in a more lighter way. They were still, you know, cooking some asparagus, but serving with sauce grebeche, but just making it a bit more lighter. And it fascinated me, this. I looked at it and went, oh, you know, I looked at it completely the wrong way, and all my time in Paris I felt maybe I've been wasted. So I started to research old books, and you have a vast amount of information in old gastronomy books, vast amounts. You can pick up a really modern cookbook right now, and it has all the different sous vide techniques in the world. And you can look at a very old cookbook and you go, well, how did they reduce the same techniques as essentially what is, I think, cheating in some ways? So when I came to eventually open Le Cochon Aveugle, once again I came under fault of being a young man and looking at what was trendy rather than delicious when we very first opened. And, you know, the sous vide machines came out, and I'm not against using modern techniques. In certain techniques, they are very good. But I wanted to do something different, and French food in this country became quite unpopular. It became unfashionable. It wasn't looked upon in the same way. A new wave of Scandinavian food and modern Spanish food sort of to take over the scene of the dining, especially in London. And after 2 years of being heavily influenced by those techniques, I looked at it and was like, well, I'm just the same as everybody else right now. I'm not doing anything differently. So then the old cookbooks came back out, and I started to look through, and what could, if I looked backwards, could I move forwards? And it was a big, massive turning point of my food and the way I looked at how I cook, and starting to look at the history, the real history of food. And maybe if I apply these old cooking techniques, maybe I can get a flavor out of food that nobody else produces right now in the country. So I'll just throw out a few examples of like really the big turning points are. So I saw a lot of, you know, game, for instance. Not a lot of people started to cook game anymore, you know, big flavors of game, and that, you know, became unpopular. But I thought, you know what, I'm just going to make people eat it. So at my restaurant, there's a set menu. It's a blind menu, so you would walk in tomorrow, and there's no menu, and I give you whatever I decide to cook that day. So to put hare on the menu as the main course, hare à la royale, was a huge risk, essentially, because it is a strong flavor. But I really wanted to do it because I believed in the classical cooking techniques of it. I believed what it stood for. So basically, you bone out a whole hare, stuff it with duck's liver and a farce, roll it up, cook it in a stock, and then with the blood of the hare, you make a thickened sauce and cover it. It's like a big sheen over it. And then we serve it to the guests with a few fruits. And it had a 50-50 response. But it set me apart from what most other people were doing. Nobody else in York was serving that dish at the time, and I don't suppose you would find it in game season this year coming up. And it set me apart. So then I read into, right, well, we've done a classical dish. How about we then look at actual really old-fashioned techniques of cooking? And I looked at old-fashioned equipment. So originally, I was talking to Frances earlier about it, I wanted what's called a duck press, where essentially you cook a duck, take the breasts and legs off, and then you crush the bones in front of all your guests, and out comes the juice, and you make the sauce in front of your diners. And I thought, oh, this would be wonderful. But unfortunately, they cost about £3,000, and I didn't want to take that out of my pocket. So then I was on a trip in the Savoie region of France, skiing, and I went to a restaurant which they were using what's called a flambeau à lard, or a flamadou, which is called in Scandinavian. And essentially, it's a long iron pipe with an iron funnel with a hole on the bottom of it. And I was fascinated, and they put it in the flame so it went glowing red hot. And I was fascinated by that. I'd never seen it before in my life. So I asked the chef about it, and he showed me what it was. And you essentially get the iron red hot, and then you put cold lard in the funnel, and it's so hot that it ignites. And then a lard flame goes down and cooks whatever you choose to cook, whether it would be a steak or it would be oysters. And I decided to get one made for myself at the restaurant. And the point is right there, I looked back in history and used this old-fashioned technique, and it was delicious. We cook oysters with lamb fat over it. And I'm producing a dish that nobody else, to my knowledge, in the UK is producing right now, and it's delicious. And that wasn't me using any new techniques. I was just looking at the history of what happened in France before the use of pots and pans. How did they sear steaks? How did they sear a chicken? And then we found a dish, and that's how real modern cooking in my restaurant is done. And so then just my biggest point, and just before I go, was the use of sous vide. And it is, if none of you know what a sous vide is, essentially it's putting a piece of protein or a vegetable in a vacuum-sealed bag and cooking it at a certain temperature to get consistent results. Now, it has different views from different chefs. Some are very against it, some are very for it. People like me use it for specific types of cuts of meat if I think they need a longer period of cooking time. But I found myself reliant on it in a way, and I found my chefs becoming lazy, and they weren't really learning how to cook, and I wanted to steer them away from this technique. So I really enjoy French guinea fowl. We have a supplier of getting French guinea fowl over. I really like its fatty qualities. And I read in a technique of cooking the whole bird in a pig's bladder. And so essentially you get the bird, put it in the pig's bladder, put some truffles, some mushroom stock, some chicken stock, and a little bit of its livers in there, tie it round twice, and then you put it in a pan of simmering stock, and it sort of inflates like a massive balloon, and then you take it to your guests and cut it open. And once again, it was a really good point of looking back in history of how something is done rather than looking forward, because the result was far superior than the actual sous videing of the chicken, which I was doing before. And right there, I always needed to remember my few years of cooking. Sometimes, and most of the times, it's better to look back in history rather than forward. And when you look back, you manage to move a lot more forward in history, and you get to eat food where it actually tastes of the region, it tastes of where it's from, and for me, it actually tastes of France and the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua, for achieving the making everyone hungry part of the discussion. Fascinating and very personal discussion of the importance of history in French cooking and the way that that can be applied in cooking here in Britain. And our next speaker, I think, knows probably certainly as much as anyone about the history of food here in England. It's Diane Purkiss, who is Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford at Keble College. And is currently working on a book on the history of food in England and is going to talk to us about food on this side of the channel in both the past and perhaps a little bit in the present as well. So thank you, Diane.
Thank you. Well, it is all about identity and alienation, isn't it? And so I want to start with a story about a visit to a restaurant in 1974 with my family and a guest. The menu was in French. I was 13 years old, and my parents had invited my father's immediate subordinate and his wife to lunch at what was then Brisbane's finest restaurant. And the guy's wife opened the menu and started reading, and after a pause, she said, "Les poisons, that looks interesting." Which is obviously both a sad story and a funny one. The sad part of it was that she felt completely alienated. She thought she was going to be fed poison. And I, as a 13-year-old, obviously I was cruel and totally superior, but up till that moment, I hadn't realized that not everyone understood menu French. Now I'm 57, and after 10 years as a food historian, I realize nobody understands menu French, and that they never have understood it. So let's take a look at the last dinner on the Titanic, so April 1912, where the menu included the following French terms: hors d'oeuvres, consommé Olga, put up your hand when you think you know how to make this, mousseline sauce with cucumbers, filet mignon lily, sauté of chicken lyonnaise, vegetable marrow farci, that's one of my favorites, potage parmentier, and pâté de foie gras with chartreuse jelly. I'm not sure about you, but I strongly suspect that most of the people dining on the Titanic, it's this sort of weird mix of French and English, weren't really there to make sort of educated choices about the kind of food that they were going to eat. They were actually just being served an idea of what food should be, and the idea was that food should be French. But the reason that became deeply unfashionable, and I remember almost the exact moment when it did, interestingly, the restaurant with the Lay's Poisons menu had an Italian name. It was called L'Allegro. So the restaurant was trying hard to say that though its menu was in French, it was sort of really Italian. That's how confused everybody was. But the reason it got depressed was not actual French haute cuisine, which has always been just fine, but fake haute cuisine, faux cuisine, rather than haute cuisine. And that was ubiquitous, and it was particularly ubiquitous in England immediately after rationing ended, so in the 1950s. It's at that point that English cooking becomes denigrated as a poor replica of something else. And there's many, many, many stories and anecdotes from Elizabeth David and from the restaurant critics of the era that illustrate the fact that people were making flour-based sauces without cooking the flour properly. And they were using a random array of fats that they happened to have to hand to make everything from pastry to cake, because everyone had got used to making do during the war. And so what I really want to argue is that what we're seeing now in England, and it's absolutely fantastic and gobsmacking and wonderful, is the recovery of a food identity that we lost in World War II and in its aftermath because of rationing and because everybody was so broke. The English government adorably paid back the loan that America gave Britain during the war. We finished paying it off in 1981. You may not have realized that. And it's no coincidence that it's at almost exactly that point that a food renaissance starts up, because suddenly there's more money washing around. And so you get menus like this one. This is from a regional restaurant, and I deliberately choose a regional restaurant called L'Enclume, so it's still got a French name, but it's got an English chef. He's a guy called Simon Rogan. And the menu doesn't contain any French whatever, except a reference to marron egg. But the rest of it is things like pork and eel with ham fat, truffle dumpling, and fermented cabbage and ragston. Now, admittedly, it still requires some knowledge to read the menu, but of a different and more British kind. And what it shows is that people dining at a top quality restaurant now will be expecting to eat food with English names that are explicable if they don't know them already. And that's an encouraging sign, because as I said, when I was young and first started dining out, that absolutely wasn't the case. But it's also very strange, because the fact is that what's characterized English food since the Middle Ages, I'm going to make a big sweeping generalization, is porousness. English food, of all European foods, note I say English and not British, has always been the most susceptible to foreign influences. If you look at medieval cookery and you look at the kind of chicken dishes that they're preparing, they're going to remind you of the kind of thing you would nowadays eat in Morocco. And there's a reason for that. They're influenced by the returning Crusaders, who are bringing back spices and sugar. And so you start to get these huge chicken dishes with a mix of rose essence, sugar topping to make it crisp, and any amount of sweet spices like cinnamon and cloves. If you ate it now, you would swear it was North African, but actually it's British. And the same is the case for our national meal. What is our national meal, you ask? Well, it's afternoon tea, as everybody knows. Why is our national meal afternoon tea, which the French adorably actually call le 4 o'clock, in tribute to us? It's our national meal, even though it's called tea, and we all know that the beverage that we serve at it can't be prepared locally, it can't be sourced locally. You can't really grow tea in England. So weirdly, we are a nation whose second most predominant national drink comes from somewhere else. And that's very typical of the way we eat and the way we think about ourselves. We still think about ourselves really as a trading empire, and there are lots of interesting reasons for that. The other reason that I bring up afternoon tea is that it was the creation of two women. One was Catherine of Braganza. She was Charles II's queen. She was from Portugal. She was horrified that the English weren't doing tea drinking. And it was she who made tea houses fashionable. Why were they girly? Because women weren't really expected to go and visit coffee houses in the mid-17th century, which is when she became Charles's consort. Because of that, tea houses started opening up. And with tea houses came a whole array of snacks that were good to eat and enjoy with tea. From that, a second woman in the mid-19th century established the timing of what we still call afternoon tea as mid-afternoon, and that's because other meal times were changing. In the Middle Ages, you had 2 meals in the day, 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock was dinner, and that was your lot. 10 o'clock was literally breakfast. You'd been out plowing, perhaps, for some hours, or herding your animals. But then you came in and you had a snack, and it was called breakfast. 19th century saw everybody getting richer, dinner gets later, and so the Duchess of Bedford said, by mid-afternoon, it's too long till dinner, and I start having that sinking feeling. And so she instituted the custom of inviting her friends around to her house for snacks. And that basically is the model of afternoon tea, that it's meant to be a feminine meal served in mid-afternoon to defray that sinking feeling. And my favorite description of it actually comes from a novel. Novels are surprisingly good sources for how people eat, how real people eat. But this is a fantasy. This is Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, and it's her fantasy country house Mandalay. Tiny, crisp wedges of toast and piping hot, floury scones. Angel cake that melted in the mouth and his rather stodgier companion bursting with peel and raisins. And it's a lavish spread, is the point of it. But then the heroine reflects. There was enough food there to keep a starving family for a week, and that, of course, is what it's always been about. So now, what's tended to happen is that afternoon tea is something that tourists have. I don't know whether anyone here in a British family can hold up their hands and say that every Sunday they have a lavish afternoon tea of the kind my grandmother used to put on, or whether it's actually the case that this might be a birthday thing or a special celebration thing. But the point is, it's no longer a part of daily life, even for the very rich. Rather, it's become an aspect of English food cuisine that we literally commodify for other people. It's foreigners, it's tourists who turn up to hotels or tea rooms, and those institutions pitch their afternoon tea at tourists. What's really interesting about that to me is the extent to which afternoon teas, as served in big London hotels, for instance, is still all about luxury food and high prices. Tea, of course, is much cheaper than it was in Catherine of Braganza's day because it's not so subject to tax and duty. What's interesting, though, and what I as a food historian always want to know is, and perhaps this relates more strongly to what my colleagues have been talking about, I want to know who made the bread. Because if you've ever eaten afternoon tea at a posh London hotel like the Ritz and paid £75 a head for it, one of the things you're likely to be puzzled by is the poor quality of the bread in the sandwiches. It tends to be the kind that you could pick off the shelf at Tesco. There should be a special word for it. Maybe Chorleywood, the name of the process that produces it, might be a good name. And one of the things that I think central to food revivalism, in the best, most gospel, groovy way of food revivalism, is to get the integers right, to work on bread, to work on good butter, to work on good cheese, to work on how you raise your pigs and cows, and to think harder about the labor that goes into producing those things. A defect of food history, as it's normally written, that I'm trying to correct with my own work, is nobody really wants to talk about the baker. They tend to act when they download a recipe at you as though elves come in and do the actual work. And notoriously, medieval and Renaissance recipes are terribly, terribly short of information. What they tend to say is, get water and add to it flour enough. Thanks for that. Really helpful if you're trying to recreate it. But the point is, what's difficult to catch up with is a past of skill and technique. So I want to finish by just referencing the fact that this city of York had one of the most popular and well-known delicacies in Shakespeare's England, and it was called Maine bread. When James I came here, he demanded it. He said, I want the York main bread. And they dug up a baker who still knew how to make it and made him a special loaf. When he arrived again, 7 years later, nobody knew how to do it anymore. And to this day, nobody knows exactly what it was. That's how stuff gets lost. You may feel that your special recipe for chocolate cake is immortal. It isn't. Write it down and make sure that you pass it on to your children. That's how food culture gets sustained. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane, for an absolutely fascinating discussion of the porousness of English food culture and food history, and the way that it often surprises us with the directions that is taken, and the sort of constant change of something that, you know, many of the French people in the audience might think that for so many years was perceived to be very dull and boring, but actually for centuries English food has been constantly surprising. And it actually, reference to Catherine of Braganza there, I live in Portugal at the moment, and she is lauded there as well for the afternoon tea, because in the afternoon, do we have any Portuguese people here? No? In the afternoon in Portugal, we have what they call lanche. It's kind of a Portuguese way of saying lunch, but lanche actually is the Portuguese word for snack, and it's you have snacks that quite resemble English things in the late afternoon. And of course, Catherine of Braganza also is responsible for the English love of port and Madeira wine, which come from Portugal as well. So again, another example of the kind of surprising porousness of things that at first seem perhaps quite English.
Can I just interject to say that lunch in English was originally a word for a snack?
Yeah, well, exactly. So these things, the European history of these things is really interesting. Well, following on, quite interestingly, from Diane's points about the sort of forgotten women sometimes behind a lot of our food history in a culinary history that is often written by and about sort of famous male chefs. Our next speaker is Frances Atkins of the Yorke Arms, who is one of the first female Michelin-star chefs in the UK, and she's going to talk to us about her view of, as a chef and as somebody very knowledgeable about the history of food, her view of gender, food, cooking, and bringing all of everything that's been talking together. So thank you, Frances.
Excuse me. Today I'm talking about what historical role have women played and play today in a male-dominated field. Creativity takes its imagination, its inspiration from the past, and history tends to be circular. For example, many great chefs such as many great artists such as Picasso base their style taken from inspiration from the classics. And grand country kitchens tended to take cooks because it was their domain, the thing that they did. With the influence of travel, male chefs started to creep in, especially from France, and it was considered smart and sophisticated, and the work was, of course, manual, regarding strength and a degree of administration. So the female didn't have such a large role to play in something that was a natural thing to her. Of course, with the lack of equality, things soon became very male-dominated. I still find it actually quite amazing sometimes when I get phone calls at work, somebody wants to speak to the chef, and they always say, is Mr. Atkins available? And I just think, today it's a little sad, really. But in this country, there were some great female leaders. Angus Marshall, Isabel Beeton, Elizabeth David, and Julia Child, although she was American, but she had huge influence here. They have been the backbone of culinary art. Mrs. Marshall had a cookery school in London in the 18th century and again wrote many cookery books. She was the first lady to invent an ice cream machine and, believe it or not, use liquid nitrogen. So there you go. Heston Blumenthal called her one of the greatest culinary pioneers that this country has ever seen. Indeed, she was way beyond her time, and unfortunately never ever received the recognition that Isabel Beeton has had, being a journalist rather than a chef and a cook. Beeton attained great notoriety for such a short lifespan. Elizabeth David, again, was a much-travelled journalist, described Beeton as being slapdash and misleading for that time. A lady in society would not be doing such menial tasks. While Elizabeth David was a somewhat eccentric lady, she had a wonderful taste buds and must have been extremely creative, and found inspiration about writing about food. And again, as we've just heard, writing about food stimulates the imagination and makes you want to cook. With the 60s culinary explosion in this country, the demand for David's ingredients and fantastic combinations that had never been experimented with before started to make imports worthwhile. And in America, at the same time, Julia Child, a few years older than David, wrote Mastering the Art of French Cookery. That book is still, in my opinion, one of the best cookery books that has ever been written. It explains technique, it explains treatment, availability, and uses basic worldwide food preparations to its best. These are 4 women that were pioneers of culinary art in this country today. Slowly the tables are changing with sexual equality, and we are seeing a large number of women in our top kitchens. They're confident and exciting cooks, dedicated to the craft. What do they bring? Presentation, creativity, flavor combination, commerciality, and productivity. While physicians and scientists, mostly male, have always been associated with herbal tinctures and remedies for our health and well-being, we now seem to have an amalgamation of science and culinary art, and making it a very exciting time to be cooking. Would female chefs have come to prominence without male patronage? I wonder. This is now happening all over the world, and many of our female chefs are earning the great title of being the best female in the world as a chef. These women have started their careers without male influence, just pure desire. With the current fashion of plant foods, historically we see the Mediterranean countries, because of their climate, of having been prime leaders in their use of flowers, herbs, and vegetables. Storing vegetables, general fermentation of plants was part of their historic and culinary background, and seeking the epitome of a healthy diet. Once again, knowledge has been shared, worked on, improved with, and every man taking the credit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frances, and thank you to all of our speakers. Actually, the way that you were talking there about, and also Diane was talking about, the invisibility of female labour in the history of cooking, despite the fact that the history of cooking has often in the West overwhelmingly been a female preserve, remind me of something that occurred to me in my own research. My first book came out last year, and a lot of it focuses on food and the Spanish Inquisition. And there's a Spanish Inquisition trial from the late 15th century where a woman in Castile is being accused by the Inquisition of secretly practicing Judaism, which is a major concern of the early Inquisition. And a lot of the evidence that was presented against her and women like her was what they did in the kitchen. So keeping kosher, baking Jewish breads, refusing to allow pork in their kitchens, and things like that. So the Inquisition collected copious amounts of detail from neighbors, maids, all sorts of people about what women were doing in their kitchens. And in this particular trial, the woman's husband was called to give evidence because she was very adamant about her innocence, and her accusers were very adamant about her guilt, which there are all sorts of reasons for. But there's a fantastic quote where the inquisitors ask him repeatedly how it was that he didn't know that his wife was keeping essentially a kosher kitchen. And he is professing total ignorance of this, and he says, well, why would I know? The kitchen is the woman's domain. It's not my job to know what goes on in her kitchen. Which in a very heavily patriarchal society where he very much was the head of that household, I think it's a very revealing remark about the way that, especially domestic cookery, was seen for much of pre-modern European history. But as we've heard, that changed very much with the professionalization of cooking. And I wonder if we could just start our discussion by asking you, Frances, what has it been like for you in your career being a woman in not only a male-dominated field, but also a field where, as we heard from Loïc, like and also through a lot of the training and techniques and things that you talked about, a lot of the kind of classics that are held up come from books written by men, schools started and run by men, and restaurants sort of associated with famous men.
Well, it was never ever a problem to me, and I think a lot of journalists like to make it a problem. Because I was, and I have been now cooking for about 40 years, I was just absolutely interested and dedicated to my work. And I learned a lot from a great many male chefs, just through trying to grasp any amount of knowledge that I could. And I soon learnt that you have like an artist does, you have a style, and if you're a truthful person, you can't change that style. So you can appreciate other people's style, but you can't change your own. So therefore, that makes you extremely focused, and gender isn't such a problem. When it became a big problem for me was when I got bigger and I tried to build up a kitchen brigade, and I had male chefs who didn't really take me very seriously. And they weren't, but the moment that they had spent a few weeks or a few days in the kitchen, they began to see, well, yes, okay, this woman doesn't know what she's doing, and maybe I'll stick around for a bit, big deal. But, and then I had, when I started the Yorke Arms off, it was an all-female kitchen by chance. And that was good, that was busy and happy. But again, at that time, there weren't enough females to go around. There weren't people coming into the industry. Now there are. And now I think it's different. And I think society has also accepted the fact that it is a much more happy arrangement if we all work together. And respect is, the respect is there because it's founded on people's qualities.
That's really interesting you say about the fact that male chefs who initially sort of didn't take you seriously, but once they saw that you were good at what you were doing, realized it was good for their careers. It makes me think, Diane, do you think that the fact that cooking since time immemorial is something that men and women have both been involved in, but in ways that are heavily inflected by the gender dynamics of their particular societies? Do you think that that presents opportunities for historians, challenges for historians? How do you think that that influence of gender in the kitchen and the sort of invisibility, to a certain extent, sometimes of female labour in the kitchen, how should we as historians deal with that?
That's a really interesting question because it also bears on what I was saying about the people who actually plough the fields and reap the grain and so on. Food history does tend to be very partial. There's a certain kind of food history which is basically just downloading one cookbook after another. And that's really limited because it tells us very little about how people actually eat. I'd just like to ask the audience, how many of you have cookbooks that you've never ever cooked a single thing from? I know I do, and so does everyone else I know. I mean, everyone, hands up, yeah, hurrah. So, I mean, this just illustrates how ridiculous it is to say that this is food history. What you're really doing is recipe history, which is an interesting field in itself, but it's not the same. in addition, precisely because I'm a woman, of course, I know how to cook, and that's actually really useful for me as a food historian, because, no offense, Loïc, after your very modest claim about your culinary skills, which I'm pretty sure is false modesty, many food historians never try any recipes. So they will earnestly write down that this doesn't work, or that this can't possibly be made to work, when it works perfectly well, but they've never actually tried to make it. I really, really applaud your attempt to revive that fantastic way of boiling guinea fowl in a bladder, because and that's a very common kind of medieval recipe, which food historians will sort of disdain as a sausage. It's not a sausage. It's a way of ensuring that the meat stays juicy and retains its moisture. And so you get that because you're a trained chef. You get that because you're a trained chef. But unfortunately, many food historians don't get that, and it's the biggest flaw in food history.
I think the problem is then, how do you describe that on your menu?
Well,
because a lot of people are automatically going to say no. So you might use the word sausage.
No, I take it out inflated to them, so they don't have any idea what's coming at that point to them. So we take it out in a copper pan, and we say, here we have a guinea fowl poached in a pig's bladder. Some guests, and then others are quite fascinated by it. I mean, once it's on the plate and we make it look nice, they would never know. And in parts, a slight flavour, and you wouldn't actually really know if I didn't show you. But you know, you want to come and eat something different. You want to come and try something different, and we're trying to hold on to history. We're trying to revive. We're also trying to revive it. We're trying to hold on to it, because if chefs don't keep on cooking these recipes, they'll disappear.
Well, there's something very interesting that you say there about sort of recreating, but also reinvigorating historical things, because what you're doing, of course, is not simply a historical reconstruction of something. First of all, that would be effectively impossible to do in exactly the same way. It wouldn't taste the same. Our ingredients are no longer the same. Even the vegetables we grow are not the same vegetables they were growing 500 years ago. But what you're doing is using a historical technique to create something that is both modern and influenced by the past. Do your diners, I mean, this is a very sort of food historian looking at the queue of the fish and chip shop museum question, but are your diners interested in that? Like, is the overwhelming response, I like that, I didn't like that, or do people find it interesting that these recipes and these ideas are not just sort of thought up in your head with no background, but actually quite thoughtfully and consciously designed?
Well, I mean, the way I look at it is that I'm interested in it. So since they're coming, everyone who comes to my restaurants is coming to my home, essentially. So that's the way I like to serve it. It's the same with the wine. I'm interested about the history of the wine. So if they have a wine pairing with it, we'll give the history of the wine, who's made it and whose hands have been on those grapes. I will talk about the history of where the guinea fowl is from in France, because that is interesting. And I think most people appreciate that. I think there's a huge interest in cooking and chefs and hospitality in general. So we just delve a bit deeper into it and, take a technique and explain it to them, because what's the point of just, throwing the chicken on the plate without showing them, the excitement is the bladder expanding and going, or the flames from the flammadu going down. That is the excitement. I want them to see that, and you want to experience that, so they get told about it.
So it's the perception, isn't it?
It's the perception.
This is my point about menu writing. It's perception before they actually experience it.
That's exactly the point. When I first opened, I used to write the menu and give it to the guests before they would eat. But then what would happen is, I don't like the sound of that, I don't want that. If I just sort of essentially make my guests eat it, and they don't have a choice about it, then they actually realise that how delicious it is, and they're eating, and the reason why I serve it blind, and it's called the blind pig, is that exact reason. It's just so you don't have the chance to not like it, because you haven't made your mind up about whether it's delicious or not. I'm just saying it's delicious. Here we go. Eat it. It is delicious. And I would actually say 99% of people, when they have that dish specifically, go, oh, it's amazing, because it's really just delicious, succulent chicken with truffles and a lovely sauce.
But if I may, I think it was that period of faux French food that made for the dissatisfied customer who's deeply distrustful, that there was that period where people felt that the maitre d' was looking down on them, that they were meant to be able to parse a menu in a foreign language in order to look posh enough to eat there. And that, I think, probably created some of the sort of pointless antagonism that I see all the time as a restaurant diner between customers and staff. Maybe it also happens in France, I don't know. But you often see English people eating in restaurants and they're very tense. They seem upset all the time and afraid that someone's going to take something from them or serve them something that's really fake.
I think I noticed that, I have to say, living now in Portugal, and last year I lived in Spain, and one thing that I always notice is the vast majority of places that you eat out in Iberia, in terms of the classic bar, cafe, have basically the same menu, because they serve the same things out of a tiny little kitchen, and those are the classics of everyday eating. That does not mean that diners do not engage in endless conversation with the bar owner or chef about how it is done in that particular place. This always amuses me. Like, nobody here would ever do that. Nobody here would be like calling the chef out to ask how they do the sole here, even though it's grilled like it is everywhere else in Portugal. Whereas Portuguese people will call him out, and there will be an endless discussion. And because I'm trying to learn, I'm always trying to listen to other people's conversations. And it's like minute discussions. It's just like, would you just eat the damn lunch, for God's sake? There is something about that difference in attitude. And I wonder, Loïc, if I could ask you about the regional element to that, because a lot of the kind of you were saying about haute cuisine, or when we were talking about the kind of very classic French national cuisine, comes from these French cookery books. But obviously the regional recipes that you have worked with are quite different and often come from different sources. They don't necessarily come from that late 19th century sort of escoffier, like highly trained and so on, but are not necessarily any less involved or historically grounded because of that. How do you feel that the difference between sort of regional cuisine and national cuisine is in France?
So first, I think the border is not that thick. I mean, of course, you can find every book of haute cuisine. You can find some regional recipes. Actually, even the books I mentioned about regional cuisine, it's a kind of cuisine bourgeoise. So it's already a kind of idealization of rural cuisine, but you can take these recipes, these regional recipes, as being the one eaten by peasants, of course. So that's why I said that it's always a question of discourse, because it's already, there is already a filter, the filter of kind of elite, trying to, you have some urban chef or urban bourgeois trying to present what is the regional food. But I'm talking about the 19th century, but it's still valid, in 20th century. So there is this first filter, and then you can find this kind of recipe in some haute cuisine books. So there is a huge difference between what we can find in this kind of recipe books and what peasants actually ate in the 19th century.
Which is hardly anything, actually.
Yeah, and for instance, the meat was still quite rare.
Yeah.
And you have lots of meat in this kind of regional recipes. So it's that's why it's a very that's why I was talking about the reputation, the representation we have of regional cuisine, but it's very different from what they actually.
I wonder. I mean, you mentioned the idea of patrimony and these kind of regional identities locked up with particular types of dishes and so on. And Joshua, you mentioned the idea of like when you were struggling with sous vide and stuff, about how what you wanted was, food that tasted like what it was and where it came from and that had touch and feel and so on. We have two York chefs here and someone who knows a lot about traditional English cookery techniques. I mean, French cuisine and of course also wine, which is not something that we've talked about, but is also key here, the idea of terroir, like the idea of things tasting of their place. Do you guys think about that in your cooking, of like stuff that tastes, taste of Yorkshire? Yeah. What is the taste of Yorkshire? How does that influence?
The taste of Yorkshire is the using the ingredient to its best, bringing out the best qualities of that ingredient, using the water, cooking it in the surroundings, which make a difference. I mean, how often do you go on holiday and you have an amazing dish there, and you come home, you try and recreate it, you can't.
Same,
Yeah. So that's what good Yorkshire food's all about.
It's a really interesting point, if I might just ask you both, because if you go to Paris, you can go to l'Ambassade d'Auvergne, which is a regional Auvergnat restaurant in Paris, or you can go to various Breton crêperies. But if you go to London, I'd really challenge you to find a Yorkshire restaurant in London. So it's an oddity about French regional cuisine. I mean, we have just as much faith, I think, in deep England and regionality as the French have in La France profonde. And yet it doesn't register in the cooking in the capital, where if you go to an English restaurant like, say, Fergus Henderson's, one of their many St. John restaurants, it won't say Yorkshire food. And so that's, I think, something that sort of holds us back from appreciating our own food. Maybe you guys should open the Yorkshire Inn in London.
You were talking about the influence of all of these different stages of your culinary journey, and you're now cooking a very interesting and personal type of food here. Do you feel that your location in York influences that, or could your restaurant be anywhere?
It does in some ways, and I'm specific about where produce comes from. I'm very much, well, here's a very good example. I mean, I love Yorkshire beef, for instance, and a lot of food is to do with memories. So growing up, I would have Yorkshire puddings, which my family called, I don't know if anyone else knows, Yorkshire salad, which is essentially pickled cucumber and shaved onions. So then I come up with a memory, and then I go, well, I'll make a tartare of beef, make a beef dripping dressing, and then pickle cucumbers on the side. And to most people, I mean, my front of house will explain this to the guests, but a lot of people wouldn't have had Yorkshire salad. But when I eat it, that's a memory. And so, in that sort of way, Yorkshire does, influence me. It's actually quite a hard thing because I base my food very much in French. So it's quite hard to bring in my Yorkshire influence into it. But when I can, I 100% do that.
But, I mean, your background is you're classically trained.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think if a chef is classically trained, you can then add your style.
Exactly, it's a foundation. You have that foundation, and I think it's really important to have that foundation. And French cookery really is in any good chef's blood. And then you build up your own style from that. It's like a risotto. You have a risotto, and you add flavours to it.
A fantastic way to describe it. And I wonder, with that discussion of Yorkshire, whether we might get some of the views and thoughts of some of the people of Yorkshire and some of our French visitors. So if anybody has any questions, please do put up your hands. I do warn you that I'm not wearing my glasses because I broke them, so I can't really see very well. I'll point in general direction. There's somebody over there.
Right there at the back.
And then we have a microphone on each side. So.
Thank you. I'm sorry to disappoint. I'm actually not from Yorkshire, and I'm not French either. But I do have a question. So the really interesting, obviously, about gender and women's incursions into kind of public forms of cooking and chefing, and then also, obviously, women's importance in the private domain of cooking. But I just wondered if you have any thoughts on the sort of timeline in which men became a much bigger part of the domestic cooking scene, and the moment in which it started to be something that men did at home as well, and men engaging with recipes as well. And if there, when that moment arrived in England, when that moment arrived in France, and how the rise of male domestic cooking cultures, if there are cooking cultures as such, have kind of shaped recent, broader food trends, food culture, recent food history?
Diane, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll have a quick go. When I was a child, the only cooking my father would do was the barbecue. So there was some sort of masculinity around the barbecue that allowed him to be able to grill a steak or sausage. On the actual domestic grills, somehow he became incompetent. Thankfully, those days are now over, and my husband's a very good cook. But that's because I refused to do all the cooking. And so I think one of the things that happened for my generation of women was that we could actually see that if we did all the cooking, we'd always do all the cooking. So then you have to let them learn and make mistakes. So my husband actually learned to cook from Mastering the Art of French Cooking. He went to the bookshop, bought himself both volumes, and worked his way solidly through the lot. So in a way, he's quite classically trained as a result. But I suppose the difficult question then is why all men don't do that. Stop cooking for them, ladies. They'll soon learn, they won't starve. And I am seriously saying that. I think it was my generation was confident enough to insist. Some men do genuinely love cooking at home. I haven't met very many, and those I have tend not to do the cleaning up.
We had another question of the lady.
Thank you. I'd just like to say that I've got a son and a son-in-law who do all the cooking. My daughter and daughter-in-laws don't do cooking at all, so they do all the domestic cooking as well. But my real question was, how many pig bladders do you get through? and where do you source them?
I get them from my butchers dried, actually, and then we soak them in water overnight, and so they become more pliable. But, I mean, we'll use about 16 a week. My restaurant's absolutely tiny, so we do 20 covers. And the only reason I can do it is 10 customers come in at 6 o'clock, and then another 10 customers come in at 7:30. So I purposely did that because it allows me to do whole joints of meats or whole turbots and things like that. So it was a purposeful thing, what I wanted to do.
Question on this side, this gentleman here.
You were talking about the quality of produce. One of the difficulties in Britain, I think, is trying to get proper fruit from supermarkets, which tends to be picked completely raw, perhaps gas ripened, stored perhaps over several years. It is, if you've tasted real apricots in France or in Iran, they are a completely different thing from what you can find in Britain. If you wanted, say, to make a good apricot jam or an apricot tart, where would you find a good apricot in Britain today?
Frances, would you? I mean...
Well, what do you guys do for things like that? Because you're both keen about provenance and stuff, but what do you do about things that...
We don't have apricots. It's quite simple.
I mean, if I was going to use apricots, for instance, I would order them from France, essentially. I'm very... For instance, I have strawberries...
The Yorkshire poet talks about the dangling apricot, so they do have a Yorkshire past.
Yeah, I mean...
But it's a question of, again, as you've said, availability.
It's
actually getting hold of these things. And today now, it's a big... I think that's probably one of our big challenges today is fresh food. At the Yorke Arms, we grow all ours. We have our own meat. We have our own vegetables. But it's a very complicated and expensive process. But in actual fact, I worked in London underground for 3 years and thought never ever again. And for me, as you find the stimulation in your kitchen, for me, it's having a kitchen that I can see out of the window of and see what I'm growing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not specifically, I'm not the type of chef who goes, everything has to be from Yorkshire, because,
it's the best.
Something,
you get what you can.
And so, for instance, I really enjoy French strawberries, so that's where they come from right now. And once they're out of season, I'll change the dish. I can't get my hands on everything I would like all the time, and that's just the way it is, so we have to adapt. As a consumer, for the general public, I completely agree. It's very, very difficult to get, something like asparagus. It's very hard to get
in a supermarket get really good asparagus. But, you know, in San Hutton asparagus just outside of York is great, but it means you're going to have to go out to the farm and get it, and it's an inconvenience. There is always a way to get hold of the produce you want. It's just more difficult.
I think as a rule of thumb, you want to buy locally from the small producer and look at everything, you know, for the quality. It's the only thing that we can do to fight the supermarkets.
Do we have another question on this side here? We have a question here in the middle, or we'll.
I think following on from that conversation, really, I guess I just wanted to ask the food historians whether, I guess particularly in England, whether they're worried for the future of food and cookery in our homes, because they seem to be increasingly going towards artificial foods and meat replacements, things that are being made in factories, rather than being able to get our hands on good quality fresh ingredients. It feels like the consumer, we don't have much control over what's now being fed to us by these bigger corporations.
Yes. In a nutshell, absolutely. I think it's possible to be far too sanguine about the spread of home cooking, I'm afraid. If anything, I think it's been rolled back from when I was a child, that maybe more men are doing cooking. That's very nice, but actually I suspect overall fewer people are making meals from scratch, particularly. And the reason for that, I suspect, is the peculiarity of England and the long commute and the long hours working culture in the short term. If we live in a world where everybody is working 50 plus hours a week, and it also takes them an hour at each end of the day to get to and from work, then intrinsically there's going to be a market for Deliveroo et al. And also cooked chill meals. And the risk then is that people will stop having those lovely childhood memories of interesting foods that they really savor. And I mean, I've actually taught students whose idea of a treat is McDonald's, because that was where they always went for a treat when they were children. And I mean, that's going to be more and more rather than less and less the case. What can we do about it? I think those of us who care about food, it's really, really important to share that know-how. I've got a very close friend who works for the Food Commission, and one of her missions is taking classes of women, particularly women in receipt of benefits, and teaching them how to cook. These are women who are mostly handicapped by having really poor quality equipment. So there was an absolutely tragic scene just before Christmas where she said, bring in a cake tin next week and you can all make a Christmas cake to take home. And they all brought in tin cans that they'd washed out because none of them owned a cake tin, nor could they afford to buy one. So that's the other issue. Down the years, we've had endless successions of kindly do-gooders trying to persuade poor people to eat healthier diets. The big one was porridge. The 19th century, everyone wanted you to eat porridge. The problem is that if you're working class, you can't afford the fuel to cook porridge for 4 hours. And that's still the case, actually. So separately, poverty, and particularly the kind of poverty that we're seeing now around the zero-hours contract brigade, is going to be another big issue that we as a country have to address and solve.
We had another question down here at the front.
So vegetarianism and veganism seem to be growing, I think, at least in the UK. And I was wondering how important you think this might be in cuisine in the future, and how receptive, say, whether there'd be any differences between how French people would be, you know, how receptive they would be towards these types of diets compared to, say, English attitudes towards vegetarianism.
Well, as a partner of a vegetarian who does do all the cooking in my household, I actually would be quite interested to know from both of you, how do you cater for vegetarians in your restaurants? Because that is something that I've always noticed. I don't know if you would agree, like varies a lot in France. Like, my partner does not enjoy eating in France. She does not get a lot of choice. But here, obviously, the discourse around vegetarianism is quite different. How do you approach vegetarianism in a 20-seat restaurant with...
Well, I cater for vegetarians, but not vegans, just because I'm too small to just have one of my boys or girls cook a solely vegan menu. Vegetarian is easier for us to do. It's still difficult, but we do it. Yes, I mean, yeah, I don't know you about Frances.
Well, The word mise en place. Our basic mise en place is very simple, and I'm very, very particular about how it's prepared. So therefore, we cater for vegans and vegetarians. I consider it, in actual fact, a challenge, something that I like myself. And so therefore we accommodate it. But it does make, it's very, very hard for Josh, who has a small restaurant, and this is what he does, to suddenly go off piste and start preparing different foods. So to say what you do is fine.
Yeah, it's
you have to
nothing
be like that.
It's nothing against being vegan or anything like that.
No.
And we don't do dairy-free for the same reason, just because we have such a small team and I can't. For instance, if we had, let's say, a leg of lamb on and it had some, it was made with some dairy in the sauce, I can't just make one separate sauce for that one person. It's not financially doable for myself.
It's actually something that reminds me of a document that I was working on last week about some 15th century monks who were vegetarians, and their friar wanted them to all go vegan as well. And they have a major debate amongst the order as to whether they're willing to move from vegetarianism to veganism. And of course, their superiors in the church are pretty unhappy with the entire thing because the whole thing is a bit radical anyway. And it was something that Martin Luther in the early part of the Reformation was very skeptical of vegetarianism, thought it was all a bit odd, bit freaky. So it's something that actually makes me think about the way that a lot of these debates we've seen through all of the things that we've been talking about today echo through all sorts of centuries and similar debates that we have. I mean, you mentioned the circularity of creativity. I think that food is such a fascinating way to think about ourselves for those very reasons. People have always been interested in what they eat. They've always been interested in what other people eat. They've always been interested in how to prepare things. They've always had different views about what we should eat or what we like to eat or what is not nice to eat and so on. So I just wanted to thank all four of you for enlightening us in different ways about that, and thank you all for coming and listening to us talk about food history after your lunch, and I hope you all have a lovely dinner this evening to celebrate your new food history knowledge.